Vice President J.D. Vance is presiding in this imagined scene, not as a cable news gladiator, but as something colder, a calm voice that doesn't need to raise itself to sound dangerous. He speaks the way prosecutors do when they believe the facts are already marching in formation. "Senator Schiff," he says, "let me play you a call." And he makes it sound like a courtesy, not a threat. He names the date, December 18th, 2019, and he says it's the day after Schiff attended a classified briefing tied to Ukraine intelligence. Then he drops the detail meant to make spines stiffen. The other voice on the line, he claims, belongs to Jake Tapper of CNN. The room in this story doesn't react with shouting or theatrics, because the room is too trained for that. Instead, it reacts the way Washington reacts when something might be real. It goes quiet and starts counting exits. Mark Warner is there as chairman, looking like someone who read the binder yesterday and still wasn't ready today. Marco Rubio is there as vice chairman, wearing the kind of expression that says, "I want the facts, and I also want to survive the facts." A handful of senators from both parties are present, and nobody looks happy to be on the record inside a place that exists precisely because words can kill careers. Schiff is alone in the way powerful people are alone when the doors lock and the staffers stay outside. Behind Vance, the story stacks the visuals like a courtroom prop cart. An NSA director identified here as General Sarah Mitchell, an FBI director named Christopher Wray, and a director of national intelligence described as Admiral James Reynolds. They each have thick binders, the kind that are never thick because of poetry. They look grim in that particular DC way, where grimness is half concern and half message, discipline. Schiff notices them, and the narration wants you to feel his pulse pick up. If you've watched politics long enough, you know the moment when confidence turns into math. This scene is built around that conversion. Vance starts gently, which is never a good sign. He asks what Schiff discussed with Tapper the day after a restricted briefing, and he doesn't ask it like a debate question. He asks it like a question that already has an exhibit number. Schiff, in this version, reaches for the standard Washington shield. He talks to journalists all the time. It's part of oversight. It's part of informing the public. It's part of the job. He frames it as civic hygiene, as if talking to cable news is basically hand sanitizer for democracy. He's careful, because careful is what you are when you're trying to sound innocent without saying anything specific. Then the story gives Vance the button, and that button is the plot's loaded gun. He presses it, and the secure audio system crackles to life with a recording that the narrative insists is crystal clear. You can almost hear the room's collective thought. If this is real, it changes everything. And if it's not, it's still going to change everything. The voice identified as Schiff's says, "Jake, what I'm about to tell you is highly classified." And you can feel the temperature drop because nobody says that sentence unless they already know they shouldn't. The voice continues with details about Ukraine intelligence and pressure on President Donald Trump's dealings, and it's the specificity that's meant to land like a punch. The other voice, attributed to Tapper, asks whether it can be reported and whether it can be attributed, the way journalists ask when they're deciding how to protect a source and protect themselves. The narration lingers on what comes next, because it's the kind of line that, if you heard it in a real hearing, would echo for months. The voice identified as Schiff's suggests phrasing like sources familiar with the intelligence, and offers to confirm on background, which is the polite language of plausible deniability. In the story, the call even veers into timing, as if news production and political procedure are two gears that can be meshed. Vance stops the playback and lets the silence do what silence does. make everyone imagine headlines. A few senators look nauseated, which is either moral shock or the realization that the ground rules might be shifting under all of them. Schiff's face in the telling drains as if someone just pulled the plug on his certainty. Vance doesn't shout "gotcha" because people who think they have gotcha evidence don't need to decorate it. He repeats the date and the identities, and he frames the call as one example in a pattern. Then he says there are more calls, 17, he claims, and more leaks, 83, he claims. And he says the time gap between briefing and publication is often less than 72 hours. Notice the trick here, the one every political narrative loves. It uses numbers to sound clinical, and clinical is harder to argue with than outrage. Schiff is described as trembling slightly, which is not proof of anything, but it's the kind of detail storytellers use to make you lean in. And the room is described as suffocating, because suffocation is what happens when everyone knows the next sentence matters. Warner, in this version, interrupts not to defend Schiff, but to ask the question senators ask when they're picturing tomorrow's optics. What is the legal authority, he asks, and how does a call like this get intercepted? The NSA director in the story replies with the phrase designed to sound procedural, a valid FISA warrant. She says it targeted individuals suspected of unauthorized contact with foreign intelligence services, and that Schiff's communications were included based on probable cause. Rubio asks whether a federal judge signed off on surveilling a sitting member of Congress, because that's the line Americans are supposed to find unthinkable. The FBI director replies that 3 federal judges approved it, an initial order and renewals, after reviewing extensive evidence. And the key line lands, "The standard is extremely high," which is a bureaucratic way of saying, "We know how this looks, and we did it anyway." At this point, the story shifts from one dramatic moment to a methodical presentation, because method is what convinces skeptics. Vance opens a binder for 5 years, the narration says, and that phrase is the point. It's not a mistake. It's a system. He describes Schiff as the single biggest leaker in Congress, which is a claim the rewritten account treats as an allegation, not a verdict. It's presented as a theory backed by timelines, call logs, and correlation, the holy trinity of modern investigative storytelling. Schiff objects, calling it retaliation and weaponization, which is exactly what you'd expect anyone to say when PowerPoints start aiming at their reputation. Vance answers by saying, essentially, that labels don't matter if the evidence is concrete. Then the narrative does a rewind because every good political thriller wants you to see how the trap was built. It takes you 10 hours earlier to Schiff in his office reading a subpoena delivered by the sergeant-at-arms. The subpoena language is vague, unauthorized disclosures and related matters, vague enough to be nothing or everything. Schiff's advisor, Daniel Goldman, in this story, flags that it's unusual and that Vance personally requested to preside. Schiff waves it off with the kind of confidence that comes from years of surviving storms. He frames it as theater, as grandstanding, as an administration trying to look tough, and that's believable, because Washington does grandstand, and everyone in Washington knows it does. The narrative builds Schiff's public image in quick strokes. House Intelligence Committee years, impeachment prominence, media ubiquity, a book titled Midnight in Washington, and a Senate victory in California. These details are presented as context, not endorsement, because the point is contrast. The man who made a brand out of seriousness is now sitting in a room where seriousness has teeth. The story says he didn't realize an 18-month counterintelligence investigation had narrowed in on him. It calls it Level 1, The kind of label that makes it sound classified even when you're just hearing it. It places Vance in the Situation Room that morning, reviewing clips and timelines like a director editing a film. And it paints the officials as tired, the way people look when they've been carrying something heavy and unshareable. In that Situation Room segment, the story introduces the pattern as if it's a math proof. Classified briefings happen, then stories appear, and the details are too precise to be lucky. The investigators cross-reference attendance lists and conclude that one person was present for all the relevant briefings. The name highlighted is Adam Schiff, and the narrative wants that highlight to feel like a verdict stamp. But in this rewrite, it's handled as a claim within the fiction. This is what the officials say they concluded, and that conclusion is what drives the hearing. The FBI director describes the predicate as probable cause that a member of Congress was involved in unauthorized disclosures. The narration stresses how rare and high bar such surveillance is, because that's the only way the story can make the audience tolerate the premise. Then Vance asks the obvious question in the obvious tone. What did you actually find? The NSA director in the scene answers with the number 17 again, because repetition is persuasion. She lists the journalists the story says were contacted. Jake Tapper, New York Times reporters like Adam Goldman and Julian Barnes, a Washington Post reporter like Shane Harris. The claim is that the calls follow briefings, and the calls are followed by stories. The narrative includes a snippet where Schiff allegedly advises how to phrase sourcing, like officials familiar with the intelligence, which is a phrase audiences have seen 1,000 times. And that's the point. The story wants to weaponize familiarity, to make ordinary media language sound like a fingerprint. The DNI character then claims each call maps neatly to an article within 48 hours, as if journalism is a conveyor belt. Vance asks whether Schiff could argue he was just sharing impressions, not documents, and the NSA director says they have cases where the wording matches verbatim. Here's where the story leans into the most dangerous kind of detail, the kind that sounds exact. The narrative says there are calls where Schiff is allegedly reading from classified assessments word for word. It says investigators can match phrases in the recording to phrases in documents, then match those phrases to phrases in published reporting. It's presented as a chain: briefing, call, story, and the chain is the villain. In this rewrite, those are still presented as allegations within the scenario because the user asked not to convict anyone in the narration. The story's officials insist this isn't interpretation, it's duplication. Vance listens with a face like he's trying not to smile, because smiling would look petty, and he wants this to look righteous. And everyone in the room understands that the appearance of righteousness is half the fight. Then the narrative pivots to money, because audiences love motive. It introduces a Warner Media book deal worth $2.1 million as the headline number, and it treats the number like it's self-explanatory. The DNI character talks about publishing math, about advances and royalties, about how many copies would need to sell to justify that figure. The story claims the book sold around 52,000 copies, which is respectable in normal life and unimpressive in $2 million advance life. It suggests the deal looks irrational unless it wasn't really a book deal. And it drops the insinuation that the payment was for access, not prose. That's the kind of allegation that doesn't need handcuffs to ruin someone, it just needs repetition. Vance, in the story, is careful in a way that feels almost legalistic. He says they can't prove explicit quid pro quo in a criminal sense, but he frames the circumstantial picture as overwhelming. The narrative adds bulk purchases by progressive groups because bulk purchases are a political thriller's favorite plot device. It claims PACs and alliances bought tens of thousands of copies, inflating sales and funneling money in a way that looks legal until you squint. The story calls it laundering in spirit, then backs away just enough to avoid calling it a proven crime. In this rewrite, it's framed as a debate question. Are bulk book buys political marketing, or are they a financial workaround that deserves scrutiny? The narration tosses a dry line about how politicians love books, because books can be both message and money. And it lets the audience decide what they want to believe about why so many unread hardcovers end up as doorstops. The next pivot is even sharper. The Ukraine whistleblower episode from 2019. The story plays clips of Schiff saying he had no prior contact with the whistleblower, that the committee learned through proper channels, that there was no coordination. Then it presents phone records and texts implying staff contact before the complaint was filed, and it highlights Daniel Goldman as a point of contact. The narrative even corrects itself midstream on dates, which ironically makes it feel more real, like a prosecutor adjusting a timeline on the fly. In this rewrite, that correction becomes part of the texture. The details are messy, and messy details are where suspicion lives. The story's officials claim staff helped shape language for maximum impact. Then Schiff denied knowing about it. And the scene dares the audience to ask the question that hangs over half of modern politics. When does strategic messaging become something darker? By now, the fictional hearing has momentum like a train that has decided it doesn't care about brakes. The DNI describes a damage assessment in general terms, claiming sources and methods were compromised, liaison trust was harmed, and operations were adjusted. The narration uses broad categories because specifics would be classified even in a made-up story, and broad categories are enough to scare people. It describes analysts refusing to brief Congress, which is the kind of line designed to make lawmakers feel personally indicted. Schiff, in the scene, tries the constitutional defense frame: oversight, duty, informing the public. Vance answers with the framing that turns duty into danger. If you handle secrets, you don't get to freestyle them. The exchange is written to feel inevitable, like a closing argument that started an hour ago. And the senators watch, because watching is easier than intervening when the optics are radioactive. Then comes the moment every political narrative craves: the refusal to answer. Rubio, in this story, asks Schiff directly whether he made the call to Tapper, and Schiff hesitates. He is described as wanting counsel, but counsel can't be in the room because of clearances, which is both plausible and politically brutal. Schiff then invokes the Fifth Amendment in the story, which isn't an admission, but is always treated like one by the court of public opinion. Vance follows with a string of questions, and Schiff answers the same way each time, which turns a constitutional right into a dramatic device. The room reacts because even hardened senators understand how this will read outside the vault. And the narration adds a hint of bitter humor. In Washington, the fifth from theirs. What follows is the outside the room sequence. The corridor scene every thriller includes. FBI agents are described as waiting, and Schiff is told he is under arrest in this fictional account, a detail that is presented as the story's climax rather than a claim about reality. The narration emphasizes that what leaks afterward is not classified specifics, but enough to fuel a national firestorm. It imagines headlines that talk about tapes, patterns, and a senator invoking the fifth. It imagines progressive outlets struggling with the optics and conservative outlets savoring them, because that's the America we live in. Nobody wastes a scandal, they just repackage it. It imagines friends going silent and enemies becoming historians overnight. And it imagines the public doing what the public always. The narrative then jumps ahead to a Senate vote in a week, with a tally like 78-22. because numbers feel official even when they're fictional. It imagines a trial date in April 2027, because calendars make stories feel real. It imagines prosecutors playing recordings, defense attorneys arguing motive and constitutional theory, and jurors listening to tone as much as content. In this rewrite, those future events are framed explicitly as the arc of the dramatization, not as assertions about real-world outcomes. The story imagines a judge scolding Schiff for violating trust, because judges in political fantasies always deliver the moral lesson audiences want. It imagines a sentence of 15 years, because 15 sounds harsh enough to feel consequential and round enough to remember. And it imagines Schiff entering a prison in October 2027, because the story wants closure, even if real life. But the real hook of this kind of narrative isn't the handcuffs. It's the question it plants in the viewer's brain and refuses to remove. If a senior lawmaker can be portrayed as a hero on television and a liability in a skiff, what does that say about the gap between image and institution? If anonymous sourcing is both journalism's oxygen and the investigator's nightmare, how do you separate public interest from private advantage? If surveillance of a lawmaker requires extraordinary justification, what kind of evidence would make officials risk the backlash, and what kind of politics would tempt them to try? If a book deal can be interpreted as publishing optimism or as access insurance, how would any outsider ever prove the difference? And if the public only hears the story after it's filtered through partisans who profit from outrage, who is actually informed at the end of the day? There's also the uncomfortable media question, the one nobody wants asked too loudly. In this story, Jake Tapper's voice is on tape asking about attribution, which can be read as professionalism or as complicity, depending on which political tribe you're in. Is that a journalist doing due diligence, or is it a journalist making a sourcing plan with a political actor? When the phrase "sources familiar with the intelligence" appears on screen night after night, should the audience hear it as responsible protection or as a hint that the system is being gamed? If lawmakers talk to reporters, is that oversight, transparency, or is it narrative control? If reporters talk to lawmakers, is that accountability, or is it access addiction? And if both sides insist they're serving democracy, why do their incentives so often look like ratings and elections? The rewrite also leans into a subtle, very American irony. Everyone in this kind of story says they're protecting the public, but everyone also wants to be the main character. Schiff's public persona in the narrative is built around seriousness and institutional guardianship. Vance's persona in the narrative is built around disciplined confrontation and cleaning up what he claims is rot. The intelligence chiefs are portrayed as reluctant but resolute, as if they're sick of politics and yet forced to become political. The senators on the committee are portrayed as horrified but also as calculating, because horror doesn't stop votes in Washington, it just slows them down. And the viewer is positioned as the jury, even though the viewer only sees what the storyteller chooses to show. To keep this kind of story from turning into a blunt accusation, the narration keeps returning to conditional language and competing interpretations. Maybe the calls, if they existed, could be framed as discussions of public matters that sounded more specific than they actually were. Maybe the matching phrases could be coincidence, or parallel sourcing, or the result of multiple leakers that investigators want to simplify into one villain. Maybe the book deal was just a publisher betting wrong, the way publishers do, and the political math is being dressed up as criminal math. Maybe staff contact with a whistleblower was routine guidance on process, not orchestration, and coordination is a word that can swallow nuance. Maybe the officials themselves are acting in good faith, or maybe they're acting with a political agenda they can't admit. And the point isn't to settle it. The point is to keep the audience leaning forward, asking which version sounds most plausible. The satire lives in the small contrasts. In this story, the most secure room in Congress is used to discuss how information left secure rooms in Congress. The people who warn about leaks are surrounded by binders, and binders are basically paper leaks waiting for the right intern to sneeze. The phrase, "no recordings except official ones," is presented as reassurance, but it's also a reminder that official recordings can be the sharpest knives. Schiff's lawyers are outside because they lack clearances, which is both understandable and absurd for a system that expects accountability without advocates. Vance offers a delay for clearances that would take weeks, which is described as a choice that would look terrible politically, meaning the process itself pressures the outcome. And the whole thing runs on the unspoken Washington rule. What's legal matters, but what's legible on television matters more. As the dramatization closes, it tries to leave the viewer with a lingering unease rather than a neat moral. If the allegations were true, they would suggest a collapse of norms that both parties claim to cherish. If the allegations were exaggerated, they would suggest a different collapse: the use of national security structures as political theater. Either way, the audience is pushed to ask why the incentives in modern politics reward exposure and punishment more than repair. Either way, the audience is pushed to notice how quickly anonymous sources turn into anonymous villains once a story changes hands. And either way, the viewer is left with the same uncomfortable thought. In a system where careers are built on controlling information, the line between informing and manipulating is always one press of a button away. The problem with stories like this, especially the kind that unfold behind a vault door, is that they don't end when the door opens. They metastasize in the hallways, in the whispered calls to chiefs of staff, in the awkward pauses on morning shows, where everyone pretends they're still gathering facts, while already drafting the spin. The moment a narrative like this escapes into the daylight, it stops being about one senator or one recording and becomes a stress test for every institution that claims it can handle heat without melting. And in this imagined December 2026 timeline, the heat doesn't come from the alleged content alone. It comes from the mechanism. It comes from the fact that people are being asked to trust both the guardians of secrets and the people accusing someone of misusing those secrets at the same time, in the same breath. Within hours, the first thing that would happen, before any grand legal chess match, would be a frantic scavenger hunt for context. Who knew about this hearing beforehand? Who was briefed? Who authorized what? Who saw the underlying paperwork, not the talking points? Because in Washington, classified doesn't automatically mean true, and official doesn't automatically mean clean. It just means fewer people are allowed to look at it, which is comforting until you realize fewer people are allowed to challenge it too. That's why the most believable reaction in this scenario isn't instant certainty. It's instant suspicion, aimed in every direction at once. Schiff, in the story's public aftermath, wouldn't need to admit anything for the damage to begin. He'd be forced into the ugliest posture in American politics, explaining process in a world that only wants verdicts. He'd say the hearing was irregular, the timing suspect, the framing political, the leaks narrative cherry-picked. He'd talk about how oversight requires communication, how the public deserves transparency, how familiar with the intelligence is a phrase used because it protects sources and methods. He'd remind everyone that he has spent years warning about foreign interference and disinformation, years urging caution about weaponizing national security. And none of it would fully land, because once a story has the word tape in it, The human brain stops listening for nuance and starts listening for a plot twist. Vance, on the other side, would do what every administration does when it senses an advantage. He'd present himself as the reluctant adult, not angry, not gloating, just concerned. He'd say this isn't about politics, it's about institutions. He'd say it doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican if you're mishandling classified information. He'd say he takes no pleasure in it, which is the oldest line in the book, for people who absolutely take pleasure in it. And he'd let the imagery do the rest. Binders, timelines, solemn faces, words like pattern and probable cause and damage assessment. The trick is that those words don't have to be fully understood to be emotionally effective. They're designed to sound like the grown-ups have arrived. Meanwhile, the senators who were in that room would be acting like people who just walked out of a car crash and realized they're going to be asked to describe the crash on camera. Some would say they can't comment on classified matters, which is both responsible and infuriating. Some would leak their feelings without leaking details, which is practically a hobby on Capitol Hill. You'd hear phrases like, disturbing, concerning, I'm still reviewing the material, we must let due process play out. Warner would be trying to hold the center, because committee chairs always try to hold the center even when the center is on fire. Rubio would be calibrating, because Rubio calibrates like other people breathe. And every other senator would be watching the polls the way pilots watch fuel gauges. The media reaction would be the most predictable part. And that's not a compliment to anyone. One ecosystem would treat the story as the final proof of a long-held belief that elites leak, manipulate, and profit while scolding everyone else about norms. Another ecosystem would treat it as an obvious setup, a political revenge fantasy dressed in national security clothing. And the most cynical observers, who unfortunately keep getting rewarded for being right, would say both things can be true in the same universe. The coverage would become less about what happened and more about what it means that people believe it could happen. That distinction sounds academic, but it's actually the whole ballgame. A republic can survive scandals. What it struggles to survive is a permanent loss of trust in the idea that scandals can be sorted out honestly. And then there's the Jake Tapper problem, the one nobody wants to linger on because it's radioactive in a different direction. If your story includes an intercepted call with a recognizable journalist, you're not just accusing a politician of playing footsie with secrecy. You're inviting the audience to wonder whether the press is a watchdog or a partner. Tapper, in a scenario like this, would have exactly two bad options: deny the call and look like he's lying if anything more emerges, or acknowledge contact while insisting he did nothing improper and watched his words get chopped into memes anyway. Even if he did everything by the book, the optics would be brutal, because the public doesn't grade proper journalistic practice the way journalism schools do. The public grades vibes, and in the current climate, the vibe is that everyone is in on it. So the question becomes, what would proof even look like to a country that doesn't agree on what proof means anymore? In the stories world, officials say they have recordings, matched timelines, and documents. That might persuade half the public instantly. The other half would demand the underlying evidence be released. And when it can't be released because of classification, they'd treat that as confirmation of a cover-up. It's a perfect trap, because secrecy is both the justification and the obstacle. You can't show everything without endangering sources, but you can't persuade skeptics without showing something. And into that gap rushes speculation, edited clips, anonymous commentary, and the weird new folk law of the internet. If I've seen it repeated 10 times, it must be true. In a quieter corner of this fallout, career professionals inside the intelligence community would be having a different argument. Not the partisan one, but the existential one. Because if a story like this is even plausible, it means one of two things happened. Either the leak problem is so severe that surveillance of a lawmaker became thinkable, or the surveillance tools are now being pointed at domestic political targets in ways that will haunt everyone later. Neither outcome is reassuring. Analysts and operators who already feel like politics uses them as props would feel used again. Some would privately cheer accountability. Others would privately panic about precedent. The phrase high bar would be repeated like a prayer, and prayers don't calm people who know history. This is where the story's tension can sharpen without ever declaring anyone guilty. Because the real conflict isn't simply, did Schiff do X? The real conflict is, how do you maintain democratic oversight when the people doing the overseeing also live in a media ecosystem that rewards selective disclosure? How do you punish genuine mishandling without turning punishment into a weapon? How do you insist on secrecy for national security while demanding transparency for legitimacy? And how do you keep any of it from turning into an endless cycle of retaliation, where each new administration treats the last one's enemies as fair game? In this imagined timeline, you'd start seeing secondary characters emerge. People who weren't in the room but have something to gain by talking like they were. Former staffers suddenly remembering meetings. Anonymous sources describing binders they didn't read. Advocacy groups issuing statements with lots of certainty and not much substance. Everyone would be claiming to stand for principles, but the most visible principle would be attention. A comedian would make a joke about skiffs being the only places where Washington promises not to record you. And yet somehow recordings always show up exactly when they're useful. A late-night host would say, "If it's classified, how do we know it's true?" And half the country would laugh, while the other half would hear it as a confession that truth is optional now. Schiff's allies in the story's public narrative would likely pivot to a theme that's become the go-to defense for anyone under siege: selective enforcement. They'd point out that leaks have plagued both parties for decades. They'd cite unnamed examples of officials and lawmakers who talked to reporters about sensitive topics without being dragged into a basement. They'd ask why this case is being pursued so aggressively. Why now? Why under this administration? Why with the vice president in the chair? They'd ask whether the same energy exists for leaks that hurt Democrats instead of Republicans. They'd ask whether the intelligence agencies are being asked to settle political scores. And those questions wouldn't be crazy, even if they're also convenient, because institutions have earned skepticism the hard way. Vance's allies, meanwhile, would lean into the theme of hypocrisy. They'd say Schiff built a career lecturing everyone about norms, about democracy, about safeguarding information. And now he's being accused, again, accused, of doing the opposite. They'd paint it as accountability for the powerful, which is always a crowd pleaser, even when the crowd doesn't agree on the facts. They'd say that if ordinary people mishandle classified material, they get prosecuted. So why should a senator be different? They'd say that if journalists are being used as laundering channels for secrets, then it's time to draw lines. They'd say the system finally caught up to someone who thought he was untouchable. And they'd make it sound like a cleansing, because cleansing sells. But here's the part the story can underline with a little irony. Both sides would be talking about trust while actively burning it for fuel. Schiff's camp would tell the public to distrust the process, distrust the investigators, distrust the motives. Vance's camp would tell the public to distrust Schiff, distrust the media, distrust the idea that leaks are harmless. The end result is a public trained to distrust everything except the version that makes them feel righteous. And righteousness is addictive. It's also terrible for governance. In a world where this scenario is playing out, the legal thread and the political thread would braid together so tightly you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Motions would be filed. Statements would be issued. Committee members would posture about procedure. And every procedural move would be interpreted as a moral signal. If Schiff demanded delays for counsel, it would be portrayed as stalling or as basic rights, depending on who was narrating. If Vance insisted on moving forward, it would be portrayed as courage or as steamrolling, depending on who was narrating. If evidence remained classified, it would be portrayed as responsible containment or as convenient secrecy, depending on who was narrating. The facts could be the same, and the country would still split. Because the country isn't just split on facts. It's split on what facts are for. So the real cliffhanger isn't the imagined vote totals or the imagined sentencing. The cliffhanger is whether any institution can still persuade a skeptical public without resorting to pure spectacle. Can the Senate do anything now without looking like it's acting for cameras, even in a room with no cameras? Can intelligence agencies enforce rules without being accused of being political actors? Can the media cover an allegation involving the media without the audience assuming self-protection? Can a politician defend themselves without sounding like every politician who ever defended themselves? And can the public handle uncertainty, or does it demand a villain so badly that it will manufacture one if necessary? That's the tension this story is really selling. And it's why it holds attention even when it refuses to deliver an easy conviction. Because the viewer isn't just watching one man sweat. The viewer is watching a system argue with itself in a locked room, and then watching the argument spill into a culture that can't agree on the rules of the argument. In that sense, the Schiff is almost symbolic. It's the last place where people pretend the truth is shared and protected, while outside that door, the truth is a commodity. Traded, clipped, packaged, and sold. And if you want the final sting of sarcasm that feels painfully American, it's this. The most secure room in the country might be the only place left where anyone believes their words won't be misunderstood. Outside, words don't just travel fast, they travel weaponized. Outside, I can't comment is treated like confession, and I deny it is treated like proof you're lying. Outside, every question is assumed to have an agenda. And once a nation reaches that point, the real scandal isn't any single alleged call. The real scandal is that the audience no longer knows how to listen without picking a side first.